The Bloomin' Onion is the signature dish of Outback Steakhouse, but as it turns out, that's not the only place where you can get one. Texas Roadhouse has a version they call the Cactus Blossom, but believe it or not, it didn't originate at either of these restaurants. So in this episode of the Studio Review, I'm headed to the restaurant that invented the Bloomin' Onion to see how it stacks up against Outback and all the other copycats. It's a competition I'm calling the Battle of the Bloomin' Onions. So if you happen to land on this episode and aren't familiar with the Bloomin' Onion, it's an onion that's cut in a very specific way to make it look like a blooming flower, which is then battered and then deep fried. I would say it's most well known for being served at Outback, but at one point there were like 10 different places where you could buy a Bloomin' Onion. Not all of them still have it on their menu, and I'll explain why later, but I'm going to be trying every Bloomin' Onion I can get my hands on, ranking them on a tier list, and crowning one as the champion. Before I made my way to the birthplace of the Bloomin' Onion, I wanted to make my rounds at the chain restaurants. You know, just kind of establish a base for my rankings. But before I could even do that, I was checking out a community festival in my town when I stumbled across a street vendor selling, you're never gonna believe this, Bloomin' Onions. Which is crazy because I had just decided to make this episode and didn't expect to be able to find one on the street. But I decided to make that my first stop in this battle. This booth appeared to be a traveling vendor that just goes around to county fairs and festivals like this one and sells fried food. I did find it interesting that they called it a Bloomin' Onion. As you'll see here in a second, the rest of them all go by other names. And I was like, that's gotta be trademarked, right? And sure enough, it is. There's an active trademark for the Bloomin' Onion, as well as the Bloomin' Onion Man, which was a short-lived Outback Steakhouse mascot. I thought that maybe they'd get away with it by throwing a G on there or something, since the trademark is for the word bloomin' with an apostrophe, but nope. Full-on trademark infringement. I wasn't sure about the price because they didn't have any of their prices listed, but when I placed my order, I was shocked to find out that it was $15. I mean, that seems like a lot, right? While I was waiting, the guy next to me was told that his total was $25, and I think all he got was a loaded brat and a lemonade. Needless to say, this place is already off to a bad start. It took forever, but eventually I got my off-brand Bloomin' Onion, and the first thing I noticed was that the sauce was just dumped in the middle, and it was seemingly ranch. I sat down to test it out, and the pieces did not come apart super easily, which will factor into my rankings. After biting in, I was able to confirm that the sauce was in fact ranch, which is an interesting move. I saw my friend Yason, had to say what's up.
How are you? Very good, bro. Bye-bye. Good to see you. Happy to see you too, bro.
But yeah, I can't say that I loved the ranch with this. Maybe it's because it was a hot day, but I feel like a pint of ranch isn't exactly the best move in most situations. As far as the actual breading goes, it was fried pretty well. Like, it had a good crispiness to it, but there just wasn't much flavor to it when I ate it apart from the ranch. I've read that at Outback they use 17 spices in their Bloomin' Onion batter, and I'm guessing this batter had 15 to 17 fewer spices than Outback. I don't know if it was the ranch or the onion itself, but I did not feel super great afterwards. Gonna go ahead and assign this one to D tier. Next up, it was time to go to Texas Roadhouse, the home of the Cactus Blossom. Okay, while I'm waiting for the Cactus Blossom to get here, I want to thank Rocket Money, who's the sponsor of this episode. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower your bills, and manage your money better. In addition to helping track your expenses like, eating out, the app helps you to cancel unwanted subscriptions with just a couple taps. You could end up saving hundreds of dollars a year without ever having to get on the phone with a customer service representative. I'm going to get on a soapbox about the customer service industry for just a second. It is so hard to get on the phone with someone who can help you with your issue or cancel a subscription. And you have to fight them for it. It's almost like they don't actually want to understand your issue or help you. I just feel like the standards of the customer service industry have been declining rapidly, but Rocket Money helps you avoid all of that. They'll handle negotiating or canceling subscriptions for you, and you never have to wait on hold or get on the phone with anyone. If you've watched the channel before, you might have heard me talk about how I used Rocket Money to help negotiate my internet bill. It was going to go up by 50% after my 2-year introductory rate, but Rocket Money negotiated with them on my behalf, and it was able to stay the same. Thank you so much. So if you want to save more and spend less, go to rocketmoney.com/Sam Reid or click the link below to get started for free. And you can unlock even more features with premium. That's rocketmoney.com/Sam Reid to get started for free. The Cactus Blossom was only $7.99, which after the street vendor made me feel like I was getting the bargain of a lifetime. The menu says the Cactus Blossom is served with their Cajun sauce, and I was thrilled to discover that it was in a cup rather than just dumped in the center. Visually, this thing looked way better than the one from the street vendor. The breading looked super even, and the tips weren't pointy pointy, which I think just comes from how the onion is sliced. When I went to pull out a piece of onion, it tore off so easily, unlike the tug of war I had to play before. I checked under the cup and confirmed my suspicions that this one was cut differently from the first one. The way this was cut meant that the pieces were barely hanging on, so they just came apart with the slightest pull. Pretty genius, actually. Now it's probably a good time to mention that when this appetizer was first invented, it was sliced by hand, but now they make like machines that cut onions like this. You can actually get one online. But if you don't want to spend $600, they also make less intense ones, or these little templates where you can put your knife through all the slots and give you a somewhat similar result. I'm gonna go ahead and guess that Texas Roadhouse has the expensive version. Okay, as glad as I was that the sauce was not ranch, I was a little surprised that horseradish was such a dominant flavor. It was a little bit too bitter for my taste. Without the sauce, there didn't seem to be as much flavor in the breading itself as I remember there being at Outback, but still leaps and bounds ahead of the street vendor. I would also say still a very enjoyable experience, and after eating about half, I decided to tap out and bring the rest with me to a friend's house that night. I did, however, grab another piece of bread for dessert before I left. Here's a little Texas Roadhouse hack for you. They will give you the same amount of bread whether you come with 4 people or by yourself.
Wow.
I think I'm gonna go B tier for the Cactus Blossom. It was solid, but I just don't feel like it hit it out of the park. Before I head to Outback, I just want to highlight a few of the places that have had Bloomin Onion copycats at one point or another. The first is Lone Star Steakhouse. You may remember Lone Star from its heyday in the 90s and early 2000s. I mostly remember it because you could throw your peanut shells on the floor. They used to have over 250 locations, and they've actually closed all of them except for one, which is located in Guam. So if you're ever in Guam, you can go to the last remaining Lone Star Steakhouse on the planet and order a Texas tumbleweed. Although I'm pretty sure it used to be called the Texas Rose. Who knows, man? Not me, that's for sure. Chili's used to have one called the Awesome Blossom. Great name. But in 2008, Men's Health named it the worst appetizer in America, partially because, according to them, it had the same amount of fat as 67 strips of bacon. To be fair, I think they're technically supposed to serve 6 people, so that's only like 11 pieces of bacon each. Either way, Chili's discontinued their version shortly after. Different places online have claimed that Applebee's, Red Robin, and Black Angus all had variations at one time or another, but as far as I can tell, none of those restaurants currently have a Bloomin Onion copycat on their menu. All right, next it's time to go to Outback Steakhouse, aka the Australian Embassy. If you're new to the channel, earlier this year I flew all the way to Australia to eat at an Australian Outback Steakhouse location because some people commented on one of my videos saying that Outback Steakhouse wasn't Australian. Joke's on them though, because it was delightful. So yeah, before this episode, the last Bloomin Onion I had eaten was actually in Brisbane, Australia. Unironically, the best Bloomin Onion I've ever had. That location had different bread though, so it was nice to be back on American soil eating real Australian bread. I'm just kidding. I do love the bread here though. The price for the Bloomin Onion was $10.99, so $3 more than the Texas Roadhouse one, but $4 less than the street vendor. It also says the sauce is their spicy signature bloom sauce. The menu specifically calls it the original, and I'll explain in a second how that's not exactly true. The last time I was at this Outback location, they burnt the living daylights out of my Bloomin Onion, so I was nervous to see how this one came out. But fortunately, it was a nice golden color. I'd say darker than the Texas Roadhouse one, but only slightly. Also way bigger than the Cactus Blossom. Maybe that's why it costs more. The Outback website says that their onions have a 4¼ inch diameter and are a full pound after they've been cooked. The onion variety here is the Spanish colossal onion, but I'm not sure which type of onion is used at the other restaurants. The cut on this one was elite, with no pointy ends, and the pieces came off super easily. I'm guessing they use a similar machine as Texas Roadhouse, if not the exact same one. I think I liked the sauce on this one more than Texas Roadhouse. Still a horseradish base, but not quite as bitter. When I tried it without the sauce, I was impressed with the taste of the breading, so far this has been the most flavorful when eaten without the sauce. I will say this though, probably just as greasy as the one I got from the street vendor. One thing that's funny about eating Bloomin Onions is that every once in a while you'll get a piece where the breading falls off and you find yourself just eating a very large piece of warm onion. And it's like, under no other circumstances would I ever eat this much onion. But since it's deep fried, you're like, yeah, keep it coming. It's like how people joke that you'd tap out after a couple cheese sticks, but hey, if you deep fry them and call them mozzarella sticks, you could put away like 6 of those bad boys. All right, I think that in all categories except for the price and the grease, this outperformed Texas Roadhouse. Gonna have to go A tier on this one. Alright, and last but not least, it's time to visit the restaurant where the Bloomin' Onion was born. The origin story is a little fuzzy here, but I'm gonna try to lay out what we know. Huge shout out, by the way, to Brian Von Hooker over at Mel Magazine, whose research has filled in some crucial missing pieces in Bloomin' Onion lore. So on Outback's website, they say that the Bloomin' Onion was created in 1988 by Outback founder Tim Gannon. But Gannon himself has said, and I quote, "The first Bloomin' Onion was made by a friend of mine named Jeff Glowski. Glowski worked at a restaurant in New Orleans, Louisiana called Russell's Marina Grill. The general manager at the time was a guy named George Barnes. At best, I think you could say that Gannon, who's the Outback guy, collaborated with the other two guys to make the first Bloomin' Onion, but sole credit feels a little far-fetched to me. And this was in the spring of 1985. The first Outback location wouldn't open until March 1988, almost 3 full years later. So they added it to the menu at Russell's and called it the Onion Mum, like the flower. Hopefully you're starting to see the connection between all the names here. Blossom, Bloomin', flowers. They got the idea to cut the onion like that from a book about mukimono, which is the Japanese art of vegetable carving. Alright, so pretty soon after that fateful day in 1985, Gannon, the Outback guy, and Glowski, the cook, moved on to separate ventures. Barnes, the manager, stays at Russell's. And this is where it gets really good. Like, you guys aren't gonna believe this. So those two guys that left each took the Bloomin' Onion to different restaurants. Gannon to a place called Copeland's, also in New Orleans, and Glowski to a restaurant called the JoJo Ivory's in Potts Point, which is a neighborhood in Sydney, Australia. Like, the restaurant was less than a mile from the Sydney Opera House. So you guys know what this means. Hang on, I just have to savor this moment for a second. So many people have told me that the Bloomin' Onion isn't Australian. It's not authentic. And sure, it was invented in the US, I'll give you that, but I can confirm for a fact that it was served in Australia 2.5 years before the first Outback Steakhouse ever opened in Tampa, Florida. Here's an article from the Sydney Morning Herald on October 8th, 1985 that describes the Onion Mum as a crisp fried onion sculptured like a chrysanthemum. Incredible. Okay, I promise I'm gonna try the one from Russell's in a second, but I just wanna highlight 2 other interesting pieces to this story. For one, the general manager at Russell's at the time has implied in an interview that the idea for the Bloomin' Onion was taken from them and that it was a form of plagiarism. Granted, early on, Outback did credit Russell's on the menu under the listing for the Bloomin' Onion, but they haven't had that note on there in decades. And 2, apparently there's a second restaurant that claims to have invented the Bloomin' Onion. It's this place in Springfield, New Jersey called Scotty's, and it just permanently closed this summer. From what I could find, there wasn't anything on the last iteration of their menu that resembled the Bloomin' Onion. It seemed like a great place, but for what it's worth, the author of that article wasn't able to confirm the claims tying the Bloomin' Onion to Scotty's. Okay, so a few weeks ago, I flew down to New Orleans, Louisiana to take down the final boss in this battle, the Onion Mum from Russell's Marina Grill. I saw this really cool neon sign in the parking lot, and from the pictures I could find, I'm guessing that that's the original. I thought with a name like Russell's Marina Grill, they'd be right there on the water, but there actually aren't any views of the marina from the restaurant. There is a marina kind of close by, but because of the flood wall, you have to walk a little ways before you can see any of the boats. The inside lived up to the name though, with lots of boat theming and a fish tank inside the host's stand. The menu has the Onion Mum featured prominently right at the top of their appetizer page with a nice little picture, and they make it a point to call it Russell's Original Onion Mum. Feels like they're throwing a little bit of shade at Outback there. Slightly interesting, they spell mum M-U-M-M with 2 M's at the end, but on their website it's just spelled M-U-M. I'm not really sure what to make of that.
It says here at the wall. Spelled with 2 E's. Take a look.
At Russell's, the Onion Mum was $8, so tied with Texas Roadhouse for the least expensive, or I guess, second place by 1 cent. And when it came out, I was surprised to find that the sauce was dumped unceremoniously in the middle without a cup, much like the one from the street vendor. Instead of ranch, though, Russell's served a homemade rosette sauce. I also ordered some alligator sausage because when in Rome. The cut on the onion was pretty unique. It had thinner slices, pointy ends, and I would say it looked the least symmetrical out of all of them. I can't say for sure, but I'd guess they're not cutting them back there with those $600 machines. The color was pretty light, and I could definitely tell that there was pepper and other seasoning in the batter. Tasting a piece confirmed that. It had much better seasoning than both the street vendor and Texas Roadhouse. I wasn't quite ready to decide who had the better seasoning between Outback and Russell's. Once I took the first few pieces out, the sauce started oozing out super slowly, almost like a lava flow. The rosette sauce, by the way, was amazing. Definitely not horseradish based, so it didn't have the bitterness the other sauces had. From what I can tell, this sauce is in the remoulade family, but distinct enough that they call it something different, because the gator was actually served with remoulade, which was delightful, by the way. As it turns out, having the sauce dumped in the middle isn't so bad when it's not, you know, half a bottle of ranch. So when it comes down to it, I think I'd put the Onion Mum in A tier with the Bloomin' Onion. And if I had to pick just one between Outback and Russell's, I gotta give it to Russell's. Outback's onion is obviously bigger, it's more neatly cut, but I liked the sauce at Russell's a lot better. If you're a horseradish person, you'd probably prefer the sauce from Outback or Texas Roadhouse, but I just really liked that rosette sauce. And even though Outback almost definitely has more seasoning in their batter, Russell's still had enough seasoning to give it a really solid flavor. So next time you're in New Orleans, go check out Russell's. They say on their website that they were the first restaurant to reopen after Hurricane Katrina, which is pretty admirable. But if you can't make it down to Russell's, I'd recommend a Bloomin' Onion from Outback over a Cactus Blossom from Texas Roadhouse. Plus, I think Outback seasons their steak better. The bread's a little bit of a toss-up, but let me know which one you like better. Episode 5 will come out in a couple weeks, but in the meantime, just remember that even when it doesn't feel like it, it's gonna be okay. I'll see you soon.